So just a quick note before we dive in here. So this is it's a legislative briefing. So we're going to get into a little bit of wonk and weed territory here. If there's an acronym that you don't know, or if I'm referencing something that, that is confusing, please feel free to ask a question in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that and responding to them as they come up. But also know that there will be time reserved for Q&A at the end. So if it's not a burning question, feel free to sit on it, but we're definitely able to talk as we go. So without further ado, we can go ahead and hop in. So first, I thought it would be helpful to review the status quo in Washington State. So the top two primary, the election where we select the top two finishers, the only options on the November ballot, is mandated by Washington State law called RCW in virtually all instances. There's one exception, which is if you are a nonpartisan charter county. There are just a few of those, Clallam, King County, and San Juan, and Pierce County. Unless you're one of those counties, for those offices, you must have a top two primary. Now, you also may be familiar with the concept of multi-member districts or multi-winner ranked choice voting, also called proportional representation. That is expressly prohibited by Washington state law. The whole way that proportional representation works is because you have one district that's electing multiple people. Because that way, if you're, say, 33% of a district or 25% of a district, you can win a seat or a couple seats that's proportionate to your size of the electorate. But Washington state law says that if you're elected to represent the same constituency as someone else, each seat has to be treated as its own separate election and position. This is why you've probably seen in your ballot position 1, position 2, position 3. Those are arbitrary distinctions. They have no actual meaning on who they're representing or what their powers are. It is just this weird requirement that blocks multi-member districts. We have a state-run presidential primary. That's worth noting because there are some states that have party-run primaries, and we use single-member districts for congressional elections. So every congressional district elects one person. Now, a quick note here, I've left some asterisks for you at multi-member districts and the top two primary. We're going to come back to this at the very end of the presentation because there's a small detail that is worth diving into, but not quite now. And I'll also flag before I go on, I guess, that Lisa is going to be monitoring the chat, and if there's anything that she thinks is super helpful for in the moment, she's going to go ahead and pop in and flag it for us. So we'll go ahead and get that answered. So what can jurisdictions do today, right now? So you can adopt ranked choice voting to select the top two. Anyone could do that if they wanted to, a city or a county. There's no reason you can't do that. At Fairfield, Washington, we think that's kind of half of a loaf because a big part of the draw of ranked choice voting is that the top two primary kind of sucks and is a waste of time. It costs a lot of money. And we may as well just get rid of it, which is the way almost every jurisdiction in America that has adopted ranked choice voting has chosen to do so. Now, if you are one of those nonpartisan charter counties, you could right now adopt ranked choice voting and eliminate your primary and do it the same way they do it in San Francisco and Santa Fe and Minneapolis and Tacoma Park, Maryland, and Payson, Utah. Those 4 counties can do it. But that's it. That is the maximum you can do today under the current law. So if we want to do more, if we want to use proportional representation the way that they do in East Point or that they may be using in Palm Desert, California, if we want to go the way of Maine and use ranked choice voting for state elections, or if we want any jurisdiction to be able to just choose to adopt it like they can in most states, like Oregon, we have to change current state law. So how do we do that? A legislative package is our proposal. So there's 5 real bills that we're going to be getting to push in the 2021-2022 legislative session, and then sort of an omnibus bill that would combine all of these. And we're going to talk briefly about what each of these would do, and then we'll basically be done and can dive into the Q&A. So the first bill is the local options bill. All this would do is allow local jurisdictions the ability to opt out of the top 2 primary that I said is basically mandated and to opt out of the prohibition on multi-member districts. Why do we want this? Well, like we've said, the top two primary has significant problems. The results can be unrepresentative, especially in crowded fields. You still see the spoiler effect where the majority of voters can split their vote between too many candidates, and the majority of voters can actually end up with their least favorite candidate elected, and it can incentivize negative campaigning. It's a good tactic to trash your opponent under the top two, because all you have to do is beat out everybody else. It doesn't matter if you have a majority support, just as long as you have more than other people. Single member districts and at-large elections, so whether you're elected to represent District 1 or Position 1, they have terrible equity outcomes. If you are 20% of the population, 40% of the population even, as many communities of color in Washington are, you can't win a seat under an at-large system, and often even in districted systems. You can also see position politics. There was a great op-ed in the Spokesman Review by Fairvote Washington's own Trenton Miller a few weeks ago that talked about how there were a number of people filing for state representative and state positions that were just picking different positions to try to game out the system because they wanted to run against a weaker opponent, and this person's actually a vacant seat, so let's do that. And it really gets into the gamesmanship of politics that people hate, instead of being the value-driven part of politics that people like. And at the end of the day, they leave people unrepresented. There's a quick little example here of the top two primary being bad. We've talked about it before, but in the Washington State Treasurer's race in 2016, the top two finishers were Republicans Dwayne Davidson and Michael Waite. They were the top two finishers. But if you look at how the electorate actually voted, the majority of voters were actually interested in one of the Democratic candidates. And yet Democrats didn't even have an option on the November ballot. Now, this particular example cuts towards the Democrats, but there are definitely examples on both sides of the aisle. The upcoming gubernatorial race for Washington State, where we have a record number of Republican candidates, you might end up seeing something similar there. So not great. So the local options bill will be introduced again in 2021. It will be the bill's fourth year of consideration and its third legislative session. That's a fun fact because it's a truism that to get anything passed in Olympia, it has to be around for at least 3 sessions. So if cliches are something to rely on, hopefully we will be getting this bill passed next year. Most recently, the local options bill is HB 1722, which was co-sponsored by 27 Democrats, including a lot of notable champions in the legislature and 7 Democrats in the Senate. No Republicans co-sponsored the bill, but we have received commitments for Republican support in the 2021 session. So we're hopeful that with as broad of a coalition as we had last year and the new folks coming on board, that we'll be able to get it passed. And all it does, again, is those 2 things. It removes the mandate on top 2, and it allows folks to do multi-member districts. And it does define ranked choice voting, and it directs the Secretary of State to work with county auditors and experts in ranked choice voting, like ourselves, to devise rules, Washington Administrative Code, that determines what RCV elections will look like. So that if you're doing ranked choice voting in San Juan County or in Spokane or in the Tri-Cities or Seattle, it'll look the same no matter what part of the state you live in. We also wanted flexibility to be part of the option. So there are different ways to do ranked choice voting. I've said that most places in the country that use it have gotten rid of the primary altogether. But there are a few that have kept it. And in fact, there's 3 states this year that are considering ranked choice voting on their November ballots. That's Alaska, North Dakota, and Arkansas, that are adopting a variation on the top 2 primary, but where you can use a top 4 or a top 5 primary. The thinking here is that there can be value to a winnowing field if you have, say, 27 candidates for mayor. That's not enough. That's too many people to fit on a stage to have a debate, to really be able to have a meaningful ability to give folks time to articulate their positions. But if you narrow it to 5, you can fit 5 people on a debate stage, but you're much less likely to end up accidentally passing through 2 people who only had 40% of the vote. You'll have a wider array to choose from. And it enables proportional representation, the multi-winner version of ranked choice voting that, again, we can talk about more later if you would like. The second bill would adopt ranked choice voting for the presidential primary. This is really exciting to me. There are a number of states that have already done this, and there's a very good reason to do it. The number one reason is wasted votes. If you voted in Washington state early for the presidential primary, there are very good odds that you voted for a candidate who ended up dropping out of the race. On March 11th, we had a number of candidates drop out, most notably Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Now, if you voted before they dropped out, you were one of 350,000 Washington voters who voted for a candidate that ended up dropping out of the race. And actually on that day, withdrawn was winning the Washington state presidential primary. Now, if you cast your ballot after those folks had dropped out, you almost certainly did not vote for a dropped out candidate. Only 34,000 people ended up voting for candidates who had dropped out. What this tells us is that people would have voted differently if they knew someone was going to drop out. So this gets us into the same problem of strategic voting that we hate at Fair Vote Washington, where you have to think about how other people are going to vote, and well, this person's my favorite, but are they going to lose, and should I vote for this person instead? Which is a big problem. And this is solved very simply by allowing folks to indicate a backup choice. If your first favorite can't win, who's your second choice? Who's your third choice? And that would solve this very real problem we saw in the Washington state presidential primary. The other big reason is that the winner could have changed. So not only would you not have had your votes not wasted, but you could have a different outcome. 25.5% of votes were not counted. They did not allocate any delegates. They didn't affect the winner of the race. And that's enough to swing the race. That could have given Vice President Biden a mandate. It could have swung the race to Senator Sanders. And potentially, if Elizabeth Warren hadn't dropped out, if she had been the second choice of many voters, she could have ended up winning. And if you have a voting system where you don't know if the winner really was the favorite, really should have been the winner, that's not going to inspire confidence in your voting system. It's not going to reward voter turnout, and it's not good for political discourse. Thankfully, this is not new territory. A lot of people in Washington say, oh, you know, this is a scary place to pioneer because what if we get things wrong? But we're actually behind the curve a little bit here. You had 5 states in 2020 that used ranked choice voting for their presidential primary. The chart here on the left shows that voter turnout went up in all cases where ranked choice voting was used. And the graphic on the right shows that the vast majority of people use their rankings. So some people say, wouldn't people just choose to vote for one who's actually going to take advantage of this? Well, as it turns out, 72% of voters ranked more than one candidate in these states. Maine also is on this list because they adopted ranked choice voting for future presidential primaries, although they didn't get to use it in November. So we think there's a very good case to be made for us adopting that for future Washington primary elections as well. Our third bill would be to adopt ranked choice voting for congressional elections, the United States House of Representatives and the US Senate. The reason why is the exact same principles. The top 2 primary artificially winnows choices down, and it can sometimes backfire and hurt the majority of voters. It doesn't offer real competition. And sometimes, you know, we want more confidence in the results of our elections. The Harvard Business School has recommended ranked choice voting be adopted for all congressional elections as what they determined to be one of the most effective tools to push back against the hyperpolarization that we're seeing in Congress and in the greater America. Pardon me. I think if you're talking, that would be swell if you could make sure that you are muted, but we will take questions at the end. So like Maine has done, all this would do is adopt ranked choice voting for US Senate and the House of Representatives. It's pretty simple. Maine has done it. It's also going to be on the November 2020 ballot in at least 3, probably 4 states. Those are Massachusetts, Alaska, North Dakota, and Arkansas. So both blue and red, urban and rural. So there's a very good case to be made that this doesn't favor any political party. It's just a good thing to adopt. Now, the fourth bill that we want to push would be adopting ranked choice voting for state offices. So that would be executive level offices like governor and lieutenant governor and attorney general, as well as for the state legislature. So your representatives and your senators in the Washington state legislature. This also has been done in Maine, and indeed in those same states that are considering it for Congress is what they would adopt through their ballot measures. So again, we would not be at the head of the class here, but it's a good common sense thing that we could adopt. So the fifth bill that we're talking about is pretty interesting. It would be using ranked choice voting for conservation districts. Conservation districts, if you haven't heard of them, are a really weird quasi-governmental entity that get significant dollars from the state that have their own kind of private elections. You actually have to go out of your way to request a ballot. Voter turnout often is just in the single digit percentage-wise, but because it's seen as a low stakes office, it's already been used for some experiments. Earlier this year, you may have read articles about how some Seattle area voters were going to get to do online voting and voting through their smartphone. That was tested for the conservation districts because it is seen as sort of that lower stakes office. Now, this bill isn't necessarily our pick of the litter. It wouldn't transform Washington state politics or meaningfully change the landscape of political discourse in the state. But we do think that for folks who want to take things slow, this is something that they absolutely should be willing to consider, because sometimes you have the exact same problems in conservation district races where you'll have 3 or 4 people running and someone wins with less than half the vote, which generally speaking isn't something that we want to see. And then finally, we would have a bill that would combine all 5 of these in case Washington state really wants to be bold and make big progress on ranked choice voting. Now, we're almost done here, but we're going to very briefly revisit those asterisks. So at the beginning, I said you have to use top 2, and you can't use multi-member districts or proportional representation. The asterisk is the Washington Voting Rights Act of 2018. So we passed this as a state back in March of 2018, and very interestingly, someone may not be muted, so you might want to double check. Very interestingly, the Washington State Voting Rights Act actually allows jurisdictions to ignore the state law, the RCW, that mandates top 2 and that prohibits multi-member districts if you want to ignore those laws to remedy a violation of the Washington Voting Rights Act. Yakima County is actually being challenged in court right now under this same provision, and the plaintiffs from Yakima County are actually requesting that ranked choice voting be used as the remedy to resolve the violation, the alleged violation of the voting rights of the Latino community in Yakima. So just to talk a little bit more about that scenario, sort of here's the backdrop for you. Yakima County is about 50% people of color by population and over a third Latino by citizen voting age population. So when Yakima County elects 3 county commissioners, you would think that if they're about over a third of the population, the Latino community should be able to elect at least 1 of the 3 commissioners. But they've only ever elected 1 non-white commissioner in the entire history of the county. And more importantly, that they've been able to demonstrate through some math and statistical analysis that this isn't just because Latino people aren't voting for Latino candidates. Latino candidates are running for office, they're running good campaigns, and they're getting voted for, but they're unable to achieve election. So the allegation is that the current system, a districted primary and an at-large general election, creates an insurmountable barrier for communities of color to elect a candidate of their choice. And the Yakima County plaintiffs are requesting 2 remedies, or 1 of 2 remedies. So the first would be to adopt districts and use ranked choice voting. This would get rid of the primary in favor of ranked choice voting, the way that most jurisdictions do it, and would just use districts. So this is a great example of how there's that mandate of the top 2 primary, but you can get out of it through the Washington Voting Rights Act. They decided that ranked choice voting was really important because even if you create a majority-minority district, the top 2 primary can cause vote splitting. We talked earlier about the Washington State Treasurer's race, where the majority of voters split their support between 3 candidates, and as a result, the majority of voters didn't have any of the candidates they wanted to choose from in November. Ranked choice voting would solve that problem, and just like it would have solved it in the treasurer's race, the analysis shows that it would solve the problem for the Latino community here in Yakima. So this is sort of a drawing of what the map could look like. This green district down here in the southeast would be drawn to be a majority Latino district where the Latino voters would be able to elect a candidate of their choice using ranked choice voting. But the Yakima plaintiffs say that this actually isn't their preferred remedy. They think that would work, but their preferred remedy would be to use the multi-member version of ranked choice voting, proportional representation. And here's why. I've just thrown up a dot map here that shows you where people of color live in Yakima County. And indeed, you can see in the green district, there's a lot of people of color there. It's in fact 70% Latino. But there's a lot of people of color that don't live in the district. In fact, almost just as many people of color live here in the blue and yellow districts as do in the green. And if you were to use this districted system, those folks would basically not be benefiting from the remedy. The Latino community in the southeast would, but it would kind of split the community up. So instead, this really comes down to that idea of winner-take-all elections. Now, this is a little graphic that sort of drives home the point that under a winner-take-all system, it doesn't matter if you are a majority, as long as you're more than everybody else, you can get all of the seats. And under a proportional system, you would get seats proportional to your size of the population. And this is what the Yakima County plaintiffs are really requesting, that county-wide, no districts, you could vote for anyone regardless of where you live. Now you don't have to redistrict every 10 years. It doesn't matter who's drawing the lines. It doesn't matter where the population moves to. The districts will be stable because there won't be districts. And instead of saying that you have to live in this one part of the county if you want to have the voting rights remedy, everyone would have access to voting rights. And there it is. That's sort of the quick, relatively speaking, overview of our Washington State legislative package. Things that you can do to help us pass these bills. You can, first of all, attend legislative town halls and campaign town halls with candidates and help write letters to representatives. If folks know that this is something that people in their community care about, that helps a lot. Similarly, writing letters to the editor for your local newspapers or helping seek endorsements from the editorial boards of your local newspapers. The more public coverage we get, the better. Traditionally, 5 years ago, ranked choice voting was seen as a weird, wonky thing that only nerds cared about. And although nerds do care about it, like myself, we're not the only people who care about it. And so demonstrating that this is a real issue will help a lot. Now, there's also some swing districts where there are legislators who have said, I don't know, I might support it, I might not. Putting pressure on those legislators would be really helpful, and that's something that we're gearing up to do through a grassroots campaign. We'll be having, if COVID restrictions are removed, a lobby day in Olympia next year. And you can reach out to Cassie, who's organizing a lot of our grassroots activity. We're looking for volunteer leaders in legislative districts who can help coordinate letter writing campaigns and email campaigns. And if you're interested in that, and if you want to get involved in the races for state legislature in your district, you should let us know. That is basically the presentation, and I would love to answer any questions at this time.
Colin, thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Lisa Aero, Director of Fair Vote Washington, and I'm monitoring the chat. And Colin, we have one question lined up for you from Nathan Hunter. Nathan, I wonder if you'd like to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask that in your own words.
Well, okay, I don't think it's actually relevant for the short-term goals of Washington, but I put a lot of thought into, I personally think the bigger problem with the Electoral College is that it's winner take all rather than that it gives extra weight to the smaller states. Because that second thing was actually kind of on purpose. I don't think it was a great idea, but it was on purpose. Right. Oh, sorry. I got to look at where my actual camera is. My big screen's over here. This is where my camera is. It's just, I know that Washington has already signed on to the MPVIC, and it just occurred to me that, there's no reason we actually have to choose between wanting to support a national popular vote winner for the Electoral College versus wanting states to do more directly proportional representation for the Electoral College, because we could have it both ways by saying, if 278 states representing a majority of the Electoral College votes sign on to the MPVIC, then we give all our electors to the national popular vote winner, just like normal. But if for some reason that first condition doesn't happen, but 100% of the states sign on to proportional representation, then we'll do proportional representation. And it's using the same trick as the MPVIC to sort of say, like, we can't do this unless all the states agree, but if all the states agree, let's automatically do it. Or in the case of the MPVIC, states representing 50% plus one of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Like,
So
I don't know a lot about like what kind of legislation flies, or if doing that kind of complicated, there are several conditions that might interact, and this is what we do in case A and this is what we do in case B, and have these things automatically again. I don't know if that kind of stuff scares legislators, but it just occurred to me, it's like there's no reason we couldn't. But I also don't think it's a priority because I'm much more focused on, I'd rather focus on local legislative.
Sure. Yeah, so I can briefly say at least that that probably would scare a lot of legislators, but from just a pure policy standpoint, I do think moving every state to a proportional allocation of Electoral College delegates would solve most people's problem with the Electoral College, because it would actually then matter if are you winning a state with 80% or with 51%? That actually matter. And so Republicans would have incentives to campaign in blue states, and Democrats would have incentives to campaign in red states. This actually isn't without precedent. Maine already does allocate their Electoral College delegates proportionally.
Yeah, except they do it by district.
Right. It's not
they do it by district, which lets the gerrymandering double down. Like, right. We could wonk out on this. Like,
but that isn't on our radar at this time. Is something that we're taking on. But I do agree that policy-wise, it's not a bad place to shoot for as far as equitable outcomes are concerned.
Yeah, and my one tiny niggling concern about the MPVIC is that it would lock us into it. Like, it's really hard once we get to the state where we're giving all our electoral votes to the national popular vote winners, to then turn around and say, but now let's make the presidential election ranked choice without a constitutional amendment, which requires 3/4 of the state to sign on. It's a whole pain in the ass.
Hey, Nathan, thanks for those questions. And I know you and Colin could go on, and you have each other's contact information. I think I want to bring us back now. We've got a question lined up from Robin. Colin, she asks, what arguments will those who are against ranked choice voting use? I want to be able to effectively counter those arguments.
That's great. That's a very great question. There are definitely arguments that you will hear. One thing that is slightly frustrating and slightly amusing is that it's usually variations of the same argument. Oftentimes what it boils down to, particularly with legislators, but not always, is folks basically not knowing enough and wanting to be defensive because they want to do things right. They don't want to risk messing with our elections and screwing things up. So one thing I think that's probably the most common criticism you'll hear is, oh, that sounds too complicated, or oh, that sounds hard, or that sounds difficult to implement, which frankly isn't true. It would have been true 12 years ago when almost no jurisdictions in the country were doing it. But you can always push back on that basically by saying, not only do you have 24 jurisdictions across the US using some version of ranked choice voting, but they're implementing it for almost no cost, in some cases literally no cost, and they're implementing them on quick timelines. The city of Santa Fe, New Mexico implemented ranked choice voting in just 90 days, or back in 2018. They had been fighting implementation. They didn't think they were going to have to, and then a court ruled against them. And they had less than 3 months to implement ranked choice voting. And after the election, the city actually put out a memo saying, you know what, going into this, we thought this was going to be a disaster. We thought we'd have really long lines. We thought there'd be so much voter confusion and spoiled ballots, and it would undermine confidence in the election. We tried to stop this in court. But, and this is a quote from the city of Santa Fe, those concerns proved to be unfounded. That with relatively modest amounts of money on a very small time frame, they're able to conduct a robust voter education model that led to high participation, high confidence in the election, and happy results. Similarly, less than a decade ago, because North Carolina has these weird provisions about certain judicial races, North Carolina ran a statewide ranked choice voting election in 2012. And they had 87 days to implement it. And they'd never done ranked choice voting before at all, even on the local level. And they did it. It didn't cost much. They were able to do a high quality election, and it happened. And there's a litany of examples that have implemented it on a short timeline for a small amount of budget that have seen voters use it. So that confusion or complicated talking point really doesn't hold water. Related to that, the other one that's most common here in Washington state is, didn't they use ranked choice voting in Pierce County and it went badly or something? This comes from folks who have just a little bit of knowledge, just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be fully abreast of the details. So the short version of the story, and there is a long version if you'd like to hear it later, is that way back in 2006, 2007, Washington state wanted to move to top two. We wanted to use the top two primary, and we were told that that was unconstitutional, actually, and that instead, Washington state would have to adopt the pick a party primary. So much like what we have for the presidential primary, you would have to choose, am I going to vote for Democrat candidates or Republican candidates in the Washington primary? Pierce County people hated that. Everyone hated it, really, but Pierce County's Charter Review Commission was meeting at the time, and they decided, let's adopt ranked choice voting instead. So they adopted it and then geared up to use it for the first time in 2008. And then a few months before they used it, the Supreme Court of the United States overruled that previous ruling and said, actually, top two is fine. Everyone can use it if they want to. And then the rest of Washington state, except for Pierce County, moved to top two. And top two is what Pierce County wanted the whole time. Ranked choice voting was their second choice, ironically enough. And so at a time when almost no jurisdictions in the country were using ranked choice voting, when they didn't even want to use ranked choice voting, they had to implement a high-cost RCV election that logistically was challenging. It cost Pierce County over $1.5 million to implement this ranked choice voting election. Everyone had to have two separate ballots, one for your ranked races and one for your normal races. It took a really long time to get results back. It was complicated. It was hard. And so as soon as they were able to, they repealed it and moved to top two, which was what they wanted from the beginning. The thing is, though, costs have come way down. Maine, the state, larger than Pierce County, implemented ranked choice voting statewide for $100,000, so significantly less than Pierce County spent. Again, like I said, there's jurisdictions that have implemented it for no cost. You no longer have to have two separate ballots. Computers have come a long ways in the last 13 years, and actually they were using even older equipment at the time, so you can have a single ballot that can handle all of the races, and actually that's the way most places that use ranked choice voting do it. So if people push back on Pierce County and say it was hard or say that it was bad, that also doesn't really hold water. Their problems were really more a product of the time than they were with the voting system. The one other common thing also has to do with Pierce County, which is that a person got elected who was arguably not very qualified for office, actually got elected to the office of treasurer assessor, got in trouble, got the county sued, had to be recalled from office. And a lot of people like to say that this person wouldn't have won if it weren't for ranked choice voting. They were no one's first choice, but they were everyone's third choice. And so that's how they ended up winning. That also, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, I suppose, is a bit of a cultural myth. So if you're familiar with the way ranked choice voting works, the first thing you do is you count first choice votes only, and then you eliminate the person who has the fewest first choice votes, and then you look at the voters who chose that candidate's second choices. So if someone was no one's first choice, they would have been eliminated in the first round. So actually, if you go back and you look at this race, this problematic person who, was a lot of legal trouble for the office actually was the most popular candidate. They received more votes than any other candidate in every round of elimination. The fact is, sometimes crappy people get elected. It doesn't matter what system you have. If you think that that's the problem of ranked choice voting, then you can look to any other elected official who's been involved in a legal scandal or gotten in trouble with the feds for acts of terrorism or anything else. If they were elected under the current system, then that would be the current system's fault. So that's the other way that I would push back to that particular response is sometimes voters make wrong choices, if you look at the vast, vast majority of places that have used ranked choice voting around the country, no one else has had the experience Pierce County does. No one else has said, oh, this terrible person won and they only won because of ranked choice voting. That's a unique anomaly to Pierce County. And if you compare Pierce County to a decade and a half of other jurisdictions in 23 different states, one of those is obviously the anomaly, and that's Pierce County.
Hey, Colin,
you.
I want to jump in here and say that Cindy Black, you are invited to unmute yourself because I believe you have a question.
Yes, just a couple of quick things. One is I'm going to share a link to a chat from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Our Common Purpose, that outlines RCV and PR as options and as recommended reforms for fixing democracy. And I can, as part of the Washington Voting Justice Coalition, there's more energy around that and interest now than ever before, which we're very excited about. To get the progressive organizations finally on board for this. And then a quick question I have is, if we don't get through the legislature, what is the time frame for possibly doing a ballot initiative?
So that's a great question. And I actually originally intended to put some slides on that in here, but I decided I would save it for Q&A. So thank you, Cindy, for the opening. So indeed, if we cannot get these bills to the legislature, which we think are not only common sense, but are really good policies, we fully intend to go to the ballot and go to the people and collect signatures. We are currently having a bit of an internal discussion about whether it's better to do an initiative to the legislature or an initiative to the people. There's pros and cons to both. The timeline on both would end up being anywhere from middle of next year to the beginning of 2022. The short version of the strengths and weaknesses is an initiative to the legislature gives us a lot of time to collect signatures to the point where we can be pretty confident we would make that goal. The downside is the legislature then has the option to do two things. One is they can just pass the bill, pass the initiative language as law, and it goes into effect. But the other option is they can say, instead of just letting the people decide, which they could also do, they can propose their own alternative version of the bill. So we really like the idea of using proportional representation for the Washington State House. It would lead to a geographically balanced, diverse electorate that would represent people all across the state, regardless of where they live. If you're a Democrat in Eastern Washington, or a Republican in downtown Seattle, or a third-party voter in other parts of the state, you would likely have a representative in a multi-member district proportional representation state house. The concern is if we put that into an initiative to the legislature might say, oh, PR is really complicated. I don't want to lose my seat. Let's propose an alternate version that is just ranked choice voting, single winner districts, not proportional. And then both of those options would appear on the ballot, and that might be a source of confusion to try to have to explain to voters the two differences and why our form is better. So if we do an initiative to the people, we have significantly less time to gather signatures, but the legislature can't muck with it. So if we want to go for proportional representation, then by gum, we get to go for PR, and that'll be on the ballot if we can make the signature requirement. So those are sort of the two options, but we're committed to doing an initiative if we don't get the ranked choice voting policies that we need through the legislature to get passed.
Thank you. Colin, you got a nice compliment from Robin on your answer for the common concerns about ranked choice voting. We got a few more questions here. Let me just start with Jacob. Jacob, you had a question that I know there's been some chat conversation. Would you like to come back and ask that? It's a question about multi-member districts. Jacob Rosenblum, would you like to unmute yourself and ask that? I'm not sure if you're feeling satisfied that you got the answer okay in the chat. Give him a moment there. The question was, do any multi-member districts exist in the wild? I love that. Interesting that the court case you referenced, because they proposed PR as a remedy, while PR has been invalidated historically, also due to racial bias. I am not exactly sure what.
So that's an amazing question that I'd love to dive into a little bit.
Okay, great.
yes, there are multi-member districts in the wild, and yes, you are correct about the sort of history of it. So an interesting note is we could not, if we wanted to, use multi-member districts for Congress because there's actually a federal law that was passed in 1967 that mandates Congress districts be single-member districts. Now, this is really interesting, though, because there's sort of two different coalescing interests that happened. So on the one hand, this was during the throes of the civil rights movement, and there were concerns that in multi-member districts, if you don't use ranked choice voting, if it's just a plurality election or block voting, a minority community, whether that's a racial or ethnic minority or a political minority, can get completely shut out of power. Because if you're electing, say, 4 people and everyone gets 4 votes, then the 60% of the population can win all 4 seats. And that is exactly what happened. And so to block that, there was an interest in passing this bill. But the interesting thing is there was some compromise from some of the folks in the South where multi-member districts with alternative voting systems had actually been successful at electing people of color that also didn't like the system. And they joined forces to prohibit them for that reason. So the short takeaway is plurality voting or first past the post or block voting in multi-member districts absolutely can create racial animus and is unconstitutional and would violate the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, using ranked choice voting in multi-member districts or a different voting system in multi-member districts not only is legal, but yes, exists in the wild. So I've got a couple examples. East Point, Michigan, last year implemented multi-member ranked choice voting as the result of a Federal Voting Rights Act settlement with the United States Department of Justice. So not only was it cleared by the courts, it was initiated by the Obama DOJ, and a city adopted it. And they used it last year. They're using ranked choice voting again this year, and they'll use it a third time in 2021. Similar to the same sort of subject is this idea of cumulative voting. So cumulative voting is a different voting system that we don't advocate for at Fair Vote Washington. It's called a semi-proportional system. It kind of relies still on strategic voting, but the end result is if you're a smaller part of the community, you can still win some seats. Illinois actually used multi-member districts. They had 3-member House districts, and they used cumulative voting up until the 1980s, and that was in their original state constitution. The interesting history behind this is that it was actually adopted in the wake of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Illinois was divided. The northern half of Illinois was pro-Union and the southern half was pro-Confederacy. And they were worried that their state would end up having a southern half that was all Republican and a northern half that was all Democrat, and that this would lead to polarization, the regions hating each other, and folks not getting along. Does this sound familiar to you? And so they adopted cumulative voting so that most districts, if you were a strong Republican district, would still send 1 Democrat, and most Republican districts would most Democratic districts would send 1 Republican. And it actually, again, functioned that way until the mid-'80s. The only reason that it was repealed had nothing to do with the system of cumulative voting, but rather the legislature voted to give themselves a pay increase. And so there was a popular initiative to decrease the size of the legislature to counteract the impact on the budget the pay increase had. And the simplest way to do that was by moving from 3-member districts to 2-member districts. 2-member districts don't work with cumulative voting, so they switched to a single-member system. But that same exact system, cumulative voting, has been used to settle numerous Federal Voting Rights Act cases, particularly in the South. And fun bit of Washington state history for you, our original proposed state constitution was modeled after the Illinois Constitution, and it actually had cumulative voting in 3-member districts. It didn't get ratified, and we came back to the drawing board and had what we have now. But you may notice that we actually do have multi-member House districts in Washington. So if you're in, Legislative District 27, you have House Member 1 and House Member 2, but they represent the same district. And that's actually a holdover from that copy of the Illinois Constitution. And the Washington State Constitution actually says that we could increase district size up to 3 if we wanted to, which again comes from that same Illinois language.
Thank you, Colin. Super quick question from Nathan Hunter. I'll just go ahead and answer. I was wondering what the relationship is between Fair Vote Washington and the Fair Vote mothership with regards to funding. That's very simple. We get absolutely no funding from them. It's all local funding that we do our own fundraising. Let's see. Let's go to Timothy Kitchen for a quick question. Do we know the general awareness of ranked choice voting statewide? Do we know the general sentiment and the chances of passing ranked choice voting statewide?
Yeah, so we have had a bit of polling work done, although it's, I guess, about a year and a half old at this point. And what we found is that, at least as of a year and a half ago, the majority of Washingtonians, a bit over half, hadn't heard of ranked choice voting and didn't really know what to think about it. It was the first time they were hearing it. But if you did know about ranked choice voting already, odds were better than 2-to-1 that you liked it. And this holds true with patterns that we've seen in other states. Typically, ranked choice voting, it kind of benefits from an exposure effect. The first time people hear about it, they don't really know. And then after a couple months of thinking about it, they often end up coming around. So what's called the tracking poll is one of the best ways to gauge real support, where you introduce the concept to someone and then you come back to them 2 months later, 3 months later, and figure out how they've moved. Generally speaking, after people learn about ranked choice voting and have some time to think about it, they like it. And so we've been doing a lot of work to grow our list. We have grown as an organization by over 5 times, 10 times. Lisa, what's the number over the last year and a half?
We're getting close to 7,000 now, and it's been we've added what 6,000 in a year.
So right, so the percentage increase there is massive. So there is work that we still need to do, but generally speaking, maybe this is, I think, more to the thrust of your question. Voters are much more interested in the idea and principle of ranked choice voting than they are the mechanics. So if you do polling and you ask about first choice and transfers to your second choice, and then if no one has enough, then you eliminate, then people can get confused. But if you keep things simple and you say, ranked choice voting allows you to have greater voice in the process. Instead of just picking one candidate, you can rank them in order of preference. So if your favorite can't win, your voice still has a chance to count for your second choice. And experiences around the country show that this can lead to more positive, civil, issue-focused campaigning, and it is better for democracy. People really like that. And if you frame it in that way, support initially often is over 50% and sometimes as high as 70%. And it actually goes up if you pair it with other political reforms. So if you say, we could do ranked choice voting, we could also bring in proportional representation, we could also bring in campaign finance and redistricting reform. That if you bring more things together and you say there is no silver bullet, but if we bring these things together, we can have a better democracy. People, to almost overwhelming degrees, supermajorities like those concepts. So the values and the messaging really on our side. It's more a question of amplification than it is figuring out what we need to say.
Colin, let me come quickly to a question here that Brian just asked. If we're aware of Represent Us and the AntiCorruption Act, just a chance for you to maybe say a few things about the value of the coalition work that we're doing here, and not only in Washington but nationwide.
Yeah, so we definitely are aware of Represent Us. In particular, their Clark County chapter have been real staunch partners of ours over the last few years. And like Lisa just alluded to, on a sort of a national level, Represent Us has been partnering with local state-based RCV advocacy organizations. They've helped out in California and in Minnesota and Tennessee. So they do a lot of really good work. As far as the coalition type stuff is concerned, that's a great introduction to this additional slide here. So you can help us out by signing up on our website here. Fair Vote Washington is starting, or is joining and helping lead a coalition called Washington for Equitable Representation. And this is a coalition of state-based groups, community organizations, local chapter groups, national organizations, labor unions, that are all in favor of a more equitable Washington state. So we're really trying to, over the past couple of years, we have worked with Represent Us and we've been on calls and we've talked about messaging and how we can help each other. And this thing that Fair Vote Washington is leading is really the effort to formalize that structure and really help solidify that we're not just one group working on ranked choice voting, but that a bunch of people like ranked choice voting. And so I think that's a big part of why we're having all of the success we've been seeing, particularly recently.
I want to thank everybody who's helping us answer some questions in the chat. So if you want to check in and see, there's some great conversation happening there. One question that hasn't been answered yet, though, comes from Stuart, who wondered what happened in North Carolina after that 2012 election.
The only reason they did ranked choice voting is because they have some really wonky, weird policies on the books that basically say if there's a vacant seat X amount of time before an election, and there's a couple other qualifiers that are met, then they have to hold an RCV election. And it just so happens that since that's been on the books in North Carolina, the circumstances have only been met once. Now they held the election without a hitch. It went off really well. Interestingly, the guy in charge of the elections there was a guy named George Gilbert, who said that he was tearing his hair out and thought it was going to be a nightmare and didn't think that there's any way that could be done. He has gone on to be one of the founding members of the Ranked Choice Voting Research Center, which is a national nonprofit that does implementation assistance for jurisdictions that want to adopt ranked choice voting for the first time or really ever. They provide resources for free in terms of best practices, ballot design, voter education. And so he became a true believer after that experience. It's still on the books. So if those conditions arise again, North Carolina will use RCV again. But not too much else has happened on the ground there.
Colin, there's been a lot of questions. We haven't gotten to quite all of them. I think we may be able to catch one or two more, but before we go on any further, I just wanted to acknowledge that we've got Cindy Black here in the audience today, Executive Director of Fixed Democracy First, and we owe such a debt to Fixed Democracy First for helping us get off the ground, Fair Vote Washington. And Cindy, you've posted in the chat an event. Do you want to just say a comment about that and anything else, Cindy, you'd like to add?
Sure. We're going to be co-sponsoring an event with Fair Vote Washington on August 13th at 6 p.m. called Equity and Democracy, Why This Moment Calls for Proportional Representation. We just finalized the speakers today, so that's why we don't have a registration link yet, but we lined up Ruth Greenwood with Campaign Legal Center, Pedro Hernandez with Fair Vote National, and then also one of the plaintiffs in the Yakima, Washington Voting Rights Act case, Susan Soto Palmer, will be part of the panel. And Mohit Nair, who's your partnerships director, will be moderating that event. So look for more information coming. We'll have a registration link coming soon.
That sounds great. Thank you for plugging that. Definitely encourage everyone on the call to join that, please.
Colin, there was a little discussion about what ballots look like with ranked choice voting and whether optical character recognition could ever be a reality here. Do you want to comment quickly on that?
Yeah, so that's my little pet side project. So for the most part in America, they're a grid, a bubble grid. So you have X, your Y-axis, and then your X-axis. And this is first choice, second choice, third choice, and then you have your list of candidates. Which is fine. That's the system. When I said that everybody knows how to use it, it's simple, it's common sense. That's the system in America that's used. It's not the only system on Earth. So if you live in, say, North Ireland or Australia, you actually have just blank boxes and you write in physically 1, 2, 3, and computers are able to do the rest. This spooks a lot of people in the United States because they're, machines reading handwriting. What if there's problems? The reason these places are able to do it is because machine learning has come a long way just in the last few years, and any things that they're not able to read get punted to human beings to take care of. So it's kind of like the CAPTCHA system. The advantage of this is it really saves a lot of ballot real estate. So if you have 27 candidates running and you can rank an unlimited amount of candidates, the ballot can be really long. This makes it super intuitive. I personally think that that type of ballot, it's called optical character recognition, or OCR, where you just fill in your number, should be the long-term goal that we want to get to, because it's the most intuitive. It's really simple for folks to understand, and there's no chance of getting misaligned on the grid. But the grid really isn't bad at all. If the grid is designed well, if you have alternating color schemes, it works just fine. So hopefully someday, but there's not much movement on that yet in the United States.
I think I want to see if I can squeeze in one last comment. It's more of a comment than a question maybe, but from Kit Muehlman up in Bellingham, who points out that we did have this exciting concurrence position that the League of Women Voters nationally has just adopted. Colin, have you noticed any effect yet in terms of of support and advancing ranked choice voting now that the League of Women Voters has effectively endorsed the principles that ranked choice voting is built on?
Yeah, well, so I can say that I think that it's had a big impact on our coalition outreach efforts in terms of getting more people to join the Washington for Equitable Representation Coalition. Folks are definitely talking about it. So I'd say that's a really big get. I also do want to close out here very briefly with a request for support if you can afford it. Fairfield, Washington started out as an all grassroots, all volunteer team. At this point, we have 2 full-time staff people that get paid and a bunch of full-time volunteers and a few contractors. And we're a really scrappy organization. The amount that we do with the amount of money that we have is kind of mind-boggling. For us to get to the point where we can win a statewide initiative, we are going to have to build up as a team. We're going to need more presences statewide, and we can only do that with more support. The only way we can hire, 5, 6, 7 more staff people is if we have more money. If you're able to afford a recurring contribution, even if it's just a small amount, even if it's $5 a month, that helps so much. Being able to demonstrate reliable, consistent support helps make petitions to foundations that give grants a lot easier. If you can say that, 1,000 people have committed to giving $5 a month, like it shows investment and buy-in. So if you can afford to support even at a low level, it would really go a long ways to helping us build the coalition that we need to win ranked choice voting statewide in Washington. And I'd strongly encourage you to do it if you can afford it. And if you can't, it would be great if you could help donate your time instead and reach out to Cassie about how you can get involved at helping us win RCV across the state.
Colin, we're going to close out the Q&A time now. I just dropped, and Cassie's dropped her email in the chat. I dropped info@fairvotewa.org in the chat. In case we didn't get your question answered, please do write back. And Cassie, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Just want to say thank you everyone for joining in today. This was a great event. You may or not have known this. This is part of our engagement drive, which we are trying to generate reoccurring donations. So if you can make that contribution, it really goes directly to supporting the ranked choice voting movement. I am one of the 2 paid employees of Fair Vote Washington. We have very little overhead. There's no office. I work from home most of the time. All of your funds really go directly to supporting and advancing ranked choice voting in Washington. If you want to see this become a reality, please consider making a financial commitment or volunteering with me. I take time and or money. They are both extremely valuable, and I will use both as much as physically possible. We put the link in the chat for the engagement drive where you can make a donation. Otherwise, you can contact me if you're interested in volunteering. Thank you all so much, and big thank you to Colin Cole for sitting here today and telling us all about the different legislative efforts that we're going to be doing to support ranked choice voting. Hope you all have a good day. Appreciate you all being here, and sign up for some more events if you can.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Hey, Timothy, nice to see you. Thank you.